Iran on the 4th of July became the latest member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a Eurasian regional forum that now includes 40% of the world's population and is focused on improving trade and security cooperation in the region. What can we infer from what was said and what was not said at the summit that included India's Narendra Modi, China's Xi Jinping, and Russia's Vladimir Putin? With the United States escalating its so-called chip war with China, the latter has decided to tighten regulations on the exports of rare elements used in the semiconductor industry. What are the positions the two sides have taken, and what are the wider ramifications of the US orchestrated trade wars of the kind that we're seeing today? And on the 75th birthday of the United Kingdom's National Health Service, a majority of Britons say the organization is what makes them most proud to be British. We ask Anna Vrachar of the People's Health Movement what the current status is of the health workforce in that country and why the Tory leadership so loathes the NHS. Salams, you're watching Daily Debrief coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi with me, Siddhant Ani. And first up on the show today, the 2023 summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was held virtually on Tuesday afternoon. The highlight of the summit was Iran joining as a full member. With this, the grouping now has 9 full-fledged members, and Belarus has also begun formalities to join the BRICS grouping separately. The summit was being held in a virtual mode, of course. India decided to do it that way, which raised some eyebrows with speculation that India wanted to avoid in-person invitations to these leaders. India, of course, denied that it was trying to dilute any of the objectives of the organization. There's been a lot of focus on the SCO in recent times. Many see it as one of the blocks that can present an alternative to the US-led so-called rules-based international order, both in strategic as well as economic terms. Prabir Purkayastha, NewsClick's editor-in-chief, joins us via video conference to talk more about what he read of the summit and the speeches that were made there. Prabir, as always, good to have you with us here on Daily Debrief. Interesting summit of the SCO from many perspectives. Of course, the inclusion of Iran now as a member is one of the key headlines. But also the role that India has been playing after the much talked about visit to the United States. Here we got to hear a sort of different side of Narendra Modi looking to, of course, emphasize their own strategic benefits, but also in that sense critical to the sort of wider conversation around multipolarity and these regional groupings and how that might affect or impact at least the US hegemony?
I think India is clear that while it considers China to be a competitor, so China is economically relatively much bigger than us at the moment, but still it does regard India as a competitor on the Asian geostrategic map, so to say, but also the fact that we have a long border which has caused tensions between both the countries. We have disputes with China on that, which led into relatively stressful conflict situations in the past. Yeah. So given that, India is trying to play, okay, Russia is an ally, at least on the Asian landmass, we need to be friendly with Russia. And at the same time, demarcating from China and looking at Pakistan as an immediate irritant. So this is, though Pakistan is a much smaller economy at the moment. India's economy is relatively big compared to many other countries, particularly those in the G7. India has actually overtaken some of them, particularly if you consider it as on a PPP basis, purchasing power parity basis, not on an export value of the rupee basis. So given that India is a big economy, as we know, the BRICS, in fact, has overtaken G7 in GDP PPP terms. And also, if we take, for instance, the SCO, that, of course, is big because it is both China, Russia, India. So that makes it a big economy. Then it has got the Central Asian countries, and now it has Iran. So given all of that, also it has Pakistan. So given all of that, India is keeping its window open on Russia and Central Asia, because this is the talking of the North-South trade corridor, the transport corridor, which Modi also talks about, with Iran as a south anchor of that, with the Chabahar port, which India had contributed to make, to build in different ways. So all of that means that we have an eye on Central Asia. We are looking at how to build a land connection to Central Asia as well as to Russia, because the other way from Russia is a much longer route that comes to India. So shortening that with the North-South trade corridor. So all of it means that India does look to maximize its geostrategic advantage, and particularly on economic issues, it's willing to take a much more independent position, independent of the G7. So I think that has become clear. Politically, of course, India still finds the United States more comfortable, given its proximity with China and its conflict with China. Therefore, also that India-US friendship is also very much something that Modi would like to maximize, in spite of the criticism of Barack Obama, the liberal sections in the United States. So that is the balancing India is trying to do. And I think that becomes clear in in SCO. And these discussions, I think, make it clear that India does see in SCO and the BRICS a counterbalancing force to the hegemony of the G7. And it wants to at least try and maximize its advantage both ways.
Beyond, of course, India's part in the entire thing, and of course we're talking about it partly because India was also hosting the summit this time. Russia and China being present in these times with the ongoing war in Ukraine is always going to bring a degree of scrutiny. We touched briefly on the part that the summit was, of course, held virtually. But beyond the optics of it, Prabir, how are these relationships developing, and what sort of part do these regional groupings have to play in also the peace process where Ukraine is concerned?
Well, I don't think SCO has much of a role in the peace process, because ultimately it's a NATO and Russia that have to decide how the peace process, if at all, will unfold. So I do not believe that we have much of a role. Even if China wants to play a role, I don't think it has much of a role. So it really today depends much more on what the United States does and what Russia does. So that's the scenario as far as Ukraine is concerned. I think in spite of Ukraine on one hand, or in spite of, say, India-Pakistan tensions, Pakistan is a part of SCO again, and the fact that the Belt Road Initiative India has dissociated itself from is because one part of the Belt Road runs through Pakistan. And that part is a disputed one, because it also goes to what India would say is Indian Kashmir and Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So essentially that is a territorial part of Kashmir. And the fact that they have rooted it through what India considers its sovereign territory, of course, is one of the reasons that the Belt Road Initiative is something India dissociated itself from. It has also made its reservation of Belt Road Initiative clear in this summit. Modi, in fact, had certain things to say on that. And that's what India would see as its national interest. But apart from that, the 9 countries of SCO, I do not think will play a major geostrategic role in terms of, say, the Ukraine war or other things. I think everybody is seeing it as in terms of trade with Central Asia and also trade with Russia. And also for Russia, for instance, trade land route to land, it's a multimodal transport route. It goes to Caspian Sea and ends up in Iran, Chabahar port, from which, again, of course, the Indian Ocean is open and you have direct port, then therefore port-to-port route that you can do by ship to India. So it shortens the entire trade route considerably. And therefore, I think it is being looked at by all sides as basically a trading mechanism, particularly because Central Asia is landlocked and it needs exits for other countries. So for Central Asia, Belt Road Initiative is particularly useful. It connects them through land to Europe. So that also China. Both sides, they have that advantage. And for Central Asia, Russia, India, Iran included, this is the north-south axis of a transport corridor. So for both sides, there are advantages to integrating Central Asia into a much larger trading system. And let's face it, Central Asia is something which you are going to see much more of, given the natural resources it has, a number of countries, its population, and so on.
China, lastly, Prabir, also keeping its window to Europe open?
Yes, I think China is keeping its windows open to all because it is the biggest trading partner for 80% of the world today. And that weight in its external account is only going to increase, not decrease in the coming future. Because with what has happened with the Ukraine war, is that the European costs of energy have gone up quite a bit. And the kind of sanctions they have imposed on themselves, basically trying to sanction Russia, has meant their economy has taken a big hit. So all of that actually increases the advantage of China in terms of many manufactured goods, which is where it was competing with countries like Germany for what would be called the high end of the engineering market. So all of this, if you put together, it does seem the European Union is the one which is going to suffer the most in all of this. And therefore, in fact, while the Ukraine war is something they should be most concerned about, they seem to be cheering the war on much more than others, in spite of the internal crisis they seem to be facing. So I think those things we'll have to see how it develops. But for SCO, I think the focus is really Central Asia. And that's true for Russia, it's true for China, it's true for India as well.
All right, thanks very much for that. Next up, China has announced restrictions on the export of rare elements, specifically gallium and germanium, which are used in the semiconductor industry. This is the latest move in the so-called chip war between the world's two largest economies. The restrictions come into effect rather, on the 1st of August this year. Meanwhile, the US and its ally, the Netherlands, are set to further restrict exports to Chinese firms of high-tech microchips, as well as machinery that is used in chip manufacturing, particularly in cases where the US thinks that these chips would be used to strengthen China's military strength. Anish has been following developments in this regard and joins us now to tell us what he has found. Anish, this announcement from the Chinese Commerce Ministry that goes into force from the 1st of August, what exactly does it entail and why these curbs at this point?
Well, technically speaking, these are not exactly curbs. It's just that they will be requiring at the moment for every company, for every buyer who buys any of the gallium and germanium products from basically it's like about 14 products of germanium and gallium ores or minerals, and they just have to register and they will be given a quota of how much they can actually export depending on various factors. It's not just one thing. So the purpose of this behind this for as per China, the Chinese government is that they want to ensure national security and also wants to ensure their national interests. And that is this is quite significant considering how this is probably the first time where national interest is invoked as a reason for imposing certain level of limitations, not exactly a ban or a block, but limitations on certain products based on national interest. And that is significant in the sense that in the grander picture that we're looking at, which is that of the chip wars that is happening already.
Right, which brings us to, I guess, the broader, I suppose, scenario. What we are seeing from commentators is that the US is likely to sort of escalate on that front in the near future, along with some of its partners in the European Union. What updates do you have for us?
Yes, US is already escalating it. It's not they haven't announced anything new in response to these such restrictions on gallium and germanium. But definitely on a larger picture, if you look at it, there were in the past month itself we had announcements of restricting imports or exports of chip making equipment
Development.
to China, and also a certain level of technological restrictions on China based on chip. And their whole, and especially with the US, we have seen the reasoning being just that they do not want the military in China to have access to their technology. And obviously, they are not using the same kind of Trump era statements of technology being stolen, because obviously the kind of evidence for that is not forthcoming anytime soon. So their whole position is that they just do not want the PLA to have access to sophisticated technology that they say will be used for all sorts of various human rights violations. Again, a smoke screen when you consider like the level of human rights violations, but by other armies, it's just different. Anyway, we also need to consider the fact that China's response is quite measured at the moment, but there's also a clear signal and warning being given, because we have to remember when it comes to rare earth mining, China pretty much is the dominant producer of that. We have as of 2022, last year, about 81%, I believe, of rare earth production of any country is being done by China. And it pretty much dominates that sector. And pretty much everybody depends on China for cheaper rare earths, uh, ores or resources, including stuff like lithium, cobalt, copper, all of which, apart from germanium and gallium, all of, even in which China pretty much dominates the market at about 60 and 40% of the global demand, serving the
Right.
global demand. So in all of these things, if China kind of puts caps on its exports on these products, and these are not especially targeted to international buyers, it's just pretty much for everyone. So there is also chances that it may not stand much scrutiny at the WTO for any kind of arguments of uh, any kind of arguments of protectionism at the moment. So in all of these respects, China has taken a step that can actually affect everybody. It hits everybody, especially the Western markets who are
Yeah.
looking for all these net zero emissions targets that they have putting up, and also their target to actually expand their electronic vehicle production. All of these depends on these O's and pretty much depends on China. And so the very basis of any kind of electronic vehicle revolution, automobile revolution, would have to depend on whether or not China is ready to sell them to you. And
Right.
that is something that is very clearly set out by that. Technology can be developed later, but it's the O's that really matter at the moment. And if that there is a paucity of that, that can actually affect markets globally.
Yeah, it will naturally, of course, do that, Anish. But thanks very much for that update, and also kind of clarifying the two sides to this sort of ongoing situation, which is likely to, I think, get a little more serious before it can perhaps get any better. And finally, the 5th of July 2023 marks 75 years of the United Kingdom's National Health Service, which currently treats over 1 million people a day in England. When it was founded in 1948, the NHS was the first universal health system to be available to all, free at the point of delivery. And today, perhaps even more so than ever before, an overwhelming majority of Britons believe that healthcare should be accessible to all, available to all, and free. Of course, the conservative politicians in this case are in the minority. They don't have the same idea and have regularly undermined the NHS. Winston Churchill was a strong opponent to its very creation, Margaret Thatcher as well, a fierce opponent, and under David Cameron more recently, per capita spending on the NHS fell the most. Anna Brachar of the People's Health Movement is with us now to talk about the NHS from the vital perspective of health workers, those who deliver the actual services. Anna, 75 years since the NHS came into being, and like you were pointing out to me just a little while ago, a majority of British people still very proud of the system and think that it actually contributes a great deal to society and all of that. Uh, what is the situation on the ground today with regards to the NHS in terms of, just in terms of one, of course, popular perception, but also how do people in the United Kingdom, in Britain, think that the service will continue in the years to come?
Yeah, so it's apparently it's a big year for anniversaries, because we have the anniversary of the WHO.
WHO, yeah.
Now we have the anniversary of the NHS, and of course both have done a lot to improve health, both globally, in the case of the NHS in Britain. So the idea, when the NHS was introduced, that it would provide care free of cost at the point of use for everyone in Britain. And with time, the NHS has been regarded and has continued, to be one of the most cherished parts by the British people, because it's actually, it's easy to see what the public health system does once you have it. Yeah. And so there was this recent survey that was done. Actually, the results were published a couple of days ago, and it shows that around more than 50% of British people consider the NHS the reason for which they consider to be proud of being British. And it's actually, if you look at the other categories, it's a funny survey, because the NHS beats essentially everything else, including British history or British business, which is, of course, also quite easy to imagine, because it's not not something that the one can be as proud of as of the NHS.
Yeah.
But the point of this being is that everyone in Britain, apart from the Tories, apparently, still knows what the NHS stands for. They very well know what is going to happen if the NHS is lost to privatization, to commercialization, to private interest, all in all. And because of that, it's quite worrying that a lot of people, including doctors, according to the British Medical Association, see the following 10 years or so as a critical moment for the NHS. They're not convinced that the NHS will continue to work as it has worked before. And so a lot of people are expecting to see out-of-pocket costs being introduced for care procedures, which are free at this point in time. And so, it has a lot to do with what's been going on in the past couple of years. And most importantly, I would say in the past year, because we have seen this very, very visible rise of a crisis in the NHS. And this is something that it's essentially going to be very, very important to address. And it's going to be a very important point to rally around, because it should be said that, the NHS should not go down without a fight. And I think that what we have seen happening among trade unions and civil society and people's campaigns in Britain shows us that it won't, that the people actually won't let the NHS go as they have imagined it to go.
You touched on, the Conservative Party's sort of take on the NHS, and even though for many of these 75 years, they have publicly at least voiced support for the service, but in policy terms and many other ways, also cut its legs at the same time. It is understandable for, I suppose, Conservative politicians to think that way. The NHS is a service that is also built on migrant labor. For example, people from all over the world contribute to the actual work that it does. In that sense, Anna, what can we expect from the government, and how do we see the resistance intensifying in the short term?
I think the point about labor that you made also is quite interesting, because today, or actually a couple of days ago, so Tony Blair found the urge to talk about the NHS again, unfortunately. And so if you look back at what he was trying to do, he was trying to increase the presence of the private sector. And what's he doing now? He's also pushing for this kind of turn. Now, of course, the Conservative Party is not shying away from that. It's they pay this lip service to the importance of the NHS because they know they have to. You cannot just go out and trash the NHS. It's not going to go well. But on the other hand, both parties are actually not not proposing anything substantial that would change the situation in the NHS. And we can take one most recent example, for example, which is a recent health workforce plan that was published, launched by the government, by the British government a couple of days ago, and we wrote about it in the People's Health Dispatch, which has been presented by them as a big deal, as something that, it's really going to turn things around, is going to resolve all the problems that we have with the health workforce in Britain once and for all. When we look at that plan, and when actually health workers looked at that plan, they pointed out a series of problems that it has, starting with the fact that the plan actually does not resolve the grievances that trade unions have raised already. So, we've seen, if I'm not mistaken, from December last year until July, and strikes are going to continue, we have seen a series of industrial action by nurses, by doctors, by physiotherapists. We are going to see actions by radiologists and other health workers in the weeks to come. So they're fighting for a fair pay rise, because they actually haven't had a fair pay rise for years.
Right.
The government's plan does not deal with that. They try to go around. They say we're going to increase the number of training spots we have. We are going to introduce health workers that need less training than the ones that we have now, so we can cut corners. But it's essentially not something that's going to resolve the problem. And I think that's also something that's been recognized by the public in Britain after the plan has been announced. There have been a number of questions about the actual impacts that this will have, and whether it can be implemented instead of increasing the investment in the NHS, in strengthening the health workforce that's there, including the migrant health workforce that that you mentioned. There have been several initiatives looking back at the contribution of migrant labor to the NHS over the past couple of weeks and months, and I think that it's also something that people are very conscious that needs more recognition now. All
right. Plenty to talk about, Anna, but I think we're out of time for today. Thanks very much for giving us that brief update on the NHS and its role in larger British society as well as politics in 2023. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. Thank you very much, as always, for watching. We also urge you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice, even if that happens to be Twitter. We'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, thank you for watching. Goodbye.